Good morning, everyone. What we're going to do today is we're going to start reviewing some of those fundamental things that you've probably looked at in your English classes, especially things about verbs, which is our focus for today. Those things that your teachers probably told you or you've had in bits and pieces in your textbooks, but no one's ever really just said, okay, here are the 5 most important things to remember about verbs. So this video is going to go over the most fundamental things really quickly. I'd say that as a teacher, about 60% of the mistakes that I hear are probably connected to verbs in one way or another. And what I mean by that is by people either using the incorrect verb in a sentence, or maybe they don't organize the information in around a verb properly. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at why verbs are important first, and then how to stop errors from occurring afterwards. Because the thing is with verbs, the reason why they're so important is that verbs give meaning. It's not a sentence if it doesn't have a verb in it. And I'll use this idea as an illustration. My relationship between me and bananas. Okay, there are 2 possibilities. I can say, I love bananas, or I hate bananas. The verb is really important in those 2 sentences because it doesn't mean the same thing because the verbs are totally opposite. Okay? Usually with verbs, the things to remember is that they express actions, they express states, especially the verb to be. And why we use them to connect nouns, noun phrases, or ideas within sentences. They show the relationship between ideas, and they show why one thing is important or how one thing relates to another idea. Now, I say actions and states, also mental activities, because those are also technically verbs, even though they're not the obvious ones because we don't always see them. Okay? One thing you'll hear a lot, one expression you'll hear a lot, especially if you're doing writing for the first certificate, is the finite verb. And a finite verb is a verb that has a tense, it has a subject, and it gives a complete idea in a sentence. In English, there are 6 ways that we organize verbs, 6 main ways. I'm not going to go into all the little subways, but there are different ways that we organize verbs depending on what we want to do with the information after. Sometimes we don't have information after a verb. Sometimes it's not necessary, or sometimes we have information that's connected to the verb, but it's not there to make the verb complete. We call those intransitive verbs because they don't show a transition between the subject and a direct object. Elvis died. That's enough. It makes sense. Elvis died in 1977. Sure, we can have a preposition or an adverb phrase after it. But we can't say Elvis died a sandwich because you don't die something. Most people, however, are more familiar with the idea of transitive verbs. Transitive verbs show the relationship between the subject and the direct object. And there are 5 basic ways that you can organize transitive verbs in English. Verb plus noun, I hate bananas. Verb plus noun plus to infinitive, I don't want to eat bananas. Verb plus noun plus that clause, I demand that you not serve me bananas. Verb plus noun plus WH clause, I want to know why you like bananas. Or verb plus noun plus preposition, I insist on never touching bananas in my life. And remember, predicate patterns can change greatly between languages. So just because a verb behaves in one way in your language doesn't mean it's going to behave the same way in English. This is especially true with prepositions because there are a lot of verbs in Spanish, for example, that use prepositions after them, but not in English. So that's really important to remember when you're learning new verbs in English. The third most important thing to remember is that not every verb can be a finite verb. Sometimes we use different verbs to help finite verbs. We use them because we have to express different verb tenses, or maybe we want to show our attitudes about the possibility or obligation. And those verbs are called auxiliary verbs. If you've ever had to study modal verbs in English, then you're familiar with this concept because you can have auxiliary verbs for time to make present continuous, past perfect, present perfect continuous, and you can also have modal verbs. And modal verbs give our interpretation of a situation. They don't work like other verbs do. They're not, you can't conjugate them. They don't have infinitives. They don't have continuous or perfect tenses. They're just there as describer verbs. Okay? Here's where verbs in English are really cool. This is the big advantage that English has with verbs. In English, verbs only have a maximum of 5 forms. This is the big thing. This is the great thing about English. Because in English, the most complicated verb that you might have is to be. Now, I don't know if that's connected to the reason why. If that's a reason why, it's also the verb that we tend to use the most frequently. But when you think about it, you really only need a handful of verbs to express every idea of to be that there is. The present simple, the infinitive, the past simple, the past participle, and remember, the past participle is pronounced been, not been, because the present participle is being, 2 syllables. Even with to do or to go, which are the second and third most common verbs in English, you still don't use that many words. With both to do and to go, the infinitive is the same as the present simple. The past simple is a little different because those are irregular verbs. And the participles, done and gone, are very similar to the infinitives, and doing and going are regular. It's worth remembering as well that with irregular verbs, only the past simple and the past participle can be irregular. The present simple and the present participle are never irregular. And with regular verbs, it is dead easy. With regular verbs, the infinitive is always the same as the present simple. The ed past simple is always the same as the ed past participle. And the present participle, ing, is always the same as the gerund. Exactly the same as the other verbs. So you don't have to worry about conjugating verbs in English. There's no need to conjugate because at most you have 5 forms. Where a lot of people tend to have problems, though, is remembering that they need to get away from the normal verbs. And I mean those little verbs that you memorize and you learn when you first start learning English. Get, go, have, do, make, say, tell. They work, people understand them, but they don't usually go connected to specific situations. And especially if you're going to be a candidate for either the TOEFL or the first certificate, one of the challenges is to understand and use verbs that are more connected to specific contexts. Because on those exams, you will lose points if you use the boring verbs. Okay, so like I said, that's a quick video to review the most important things. Feel free to visit the blog at www.stop-spanish.blogspot.ca. Always tons of stuff on there. Some of it is serious, a lot of it is not. And if you'd like more information on classes and test preparation for first certificate, TOEFL, advanced, or proficiency, please feel free to contact me at the website www.stopspanglish.com.